All right, I'm going to go ahead and call this meeting to order. This is the first meeting of the MARTA Overview Committee, MARTOC, for the 2011-2012 term of the General Assembly. New chairman, some new faces up here on the committee. And so what I'd like to do before we actually get into our agenda, which I believe has been circulated to all of the members as well as to the MARTA board chairman and to the general manager, is allow the members of the committee to introduce themselves. We'll start down there on the end with Senator Gooch and work our way around. Senator Gooch.
Yes, sir. Good morning. I'm Steve Gooch from Dahlonega. That's up Georgia 400 and all as far as you can drive. So y'all come on up and spend some money on this beautiful spring break weekend. It's good to be on this committee.
All right. Senator Butler.
Good morning. Looks like I'm back again.
It's good to have you back.
Thank you. I'm happy to be reinstated and look forward to working with all of you, especially MARTA. I've always worked with MARTA for years and years and years, so it's a renewed friendship. Not that it ever stopped anyway, but renewed for MARTOC.
Representative Geisinger.
The light didn't come on, so I didn't think it was alive. Good morning. I'm Harry Geisinger. I represent Roswell and Sandy Springs. I have served on MARTOC for the last 6 years. I was here as a member on the State Planning and Community Affairs Committee when it was created, back when Elliot Levitas was the chairman of the committee, which was back in 1969, somewhere around there.
Senator Stoner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I'm also a returning member to MARTOC, and actually I've served on this committee since began my service when I left the House, where I was trained properly, as I always say, and came over to the Senate in 2005. And as a non-MARTA County member, I've always been obviously very interested and very supportive of making the best we can with MARTA.
Representative Taylor.
Tom Taylor, I represent Dunwoody, parts of Chamblee, and parts of unincorporated North DeKalb. I'm a freshman here, and glad to be on the committee.
Representative Riley.
Thank you. Good morning. Lynn Riley, freshman at the General Assembly, but have been a past commissioner of Fulton County and worked actively with MARTA for a number of years, and look forward to a continued great relationship.
Representative Mitchell.
Billy Mitchell. I'm glad to be a returning member of this committee. I think it's been about 6 years. I represent the 88th Legislative District, Stone Mountain, and primarily DeKalb County, and a little bit of Gwinnett.
And I am Mike Jacobs, representative from House District 80, which includes much of Brookhaven. The Brookhaven MARTA station is in my district, and I have a significant amount of MARTA infrastructure, rail infrastructure in my district as well. I am in my 7th year in the General Assembly, my 7th year as a member of MARTOC, and my 1st year as chairman of this committee. First of all, I want to welcome everyone here today. The purpose of this meeting is really twofold. First is this is our organizational meeting where we will adopt rules and assign members to subcommittees. And then second, we will hear a presentation from MARTA at kind of the 10,000-foot level on some issues that I have asked for them to brief the Oversight Committee on. So let's first start with the organizational part of the meeting. If you'll open up in your folders, there is a copy of the committee rules to be adopted in today's meeting. I'll give everyone a chance to look those over. If there's any questions or discussion, we can entertain that, and then I'll entertain a motion. I'll give everyone a second to look them over. Representative Geisinger.
At the proper time, I'd like to make a motion.
Any discussion? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion. Representative Geisinger.
I move that we adopt the rules.
Is there a second? There's a motion and a second. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, the chair calls the question. All those in favor of adopting the committee rules say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. The rules are adopted. Second order of business is the assignment of subcommittees. In the past, the MARTOC subcommittees have been more ad hoc and more centered around specific issues that the chair wished to have addressed. I have decided to break the break the committee into three broader subcommittees that will deal with broader subject matters. Those subject matters are budget and fiscal affairs, governance, in particular the governance structure of MARTA and the MARTA Act, and infrastructure. The three subcommittee chairmen that I am appointing to each of those subcommittees are Representative Geisinger at Budget and Fiscal Affairs, Representative Riley at Governance, and Senator Gooch at Infrastructure. And then you can see how the membership shakes out there. And actually, I'll just read it so that everybody out there knows who has been appointed. Budget and Fiscal Affairs will be Representative Geisinger, joined by Representative Chanel, Senator Fort, Representative Taylor, and then myself and the other two subcommittee chairs serve ex officio. Governance will be Representative Riley at chair, Senator Miller, Representative Mitchell, and Senator Stoner. Same deal with the chair and subcommittee chairs. And Infrastructure will be Senator Gooch at chair, Senator Butler, Senator Miller, and Representative Tommy Smith. I should note about some of the members may sound like they're from far outside the metro area, and I should note that in addition to the appointments that are made by the governor, lieutenant governor, and speaker of the House, that the 1999 resolution that created MARTOC, it was a joint resolution of the House and Senate, provides for certain committee chairs of the House and Senate to serve as members of MARTOC. I believe that includes the chair of Ways and Means in the House, the chair of State Planning and Community Affairs in the House, the chair of State and Local Government Operations in the Senate. So each of those members are included in the list of subcommittees. Any discussion or questions on the subcommittee? I will then, on the subcommittee list, I will then talk specifically about the governance subcommittee, which is going to be tasked with starting a project almost from the get-go. Any discussion on this subcommittee list? Seeing none. The governance subcommittee is going to be tasked, and you'll see in your folders that there is a copy of the MARTA Act. I want to thank Rick Ruskell, our legislative counsel, for providing that to us. There is a copy of the MARTA Act in your folders. I would recommend, unless you are on the governance subcommittee, leaving that copy in there because we're only going to make one copy for everybody. But if you're on the governance subcommittee, you might want to take it with you. Just hold on to it, though. One thing that we are going to do on this committee this year is engage in a comprehensive review of the MARTA Act, the 1960s state law that created MARTA. It has not been reviewed in any comprehensive way since its inception. We have tinkered with it around the margins, but it has not been reviewed in any kind of comprehensive way. At the same time that is going on, we have the Transit Governance Study Commission meeting, also a legislative committee that includes the general man or the heads of the various transit agencies around Metro Atlanta, that is tasked with, for the 2012 legislative session, coming forward with a proposal for how we get to a regional transit governance structure. the idea is for this review of the MARTA Act to progress along a parallel track with that review and hopefully propose some revisions to the MARTA Act that will dovetail with the work of the Transit Governance Study Commission. Now, I cannot say sitting here today whether that will be brought forward in a separate piece of legislation or whether it will be brought forward in the same piece of legislation as the work of the Transit Governance Study Commission. But what I can say is that I am committed, and Representative Riley shares that commitment as the chair of that subcommittee, to give the MARTA Act a thorough review and come forward with ways to make it better. So that task will be assigned to the governance study subcommittee, and the very first meeting of any subcommittee of MARTOC will be that governance subcommittee meeting on that subject. And the first meeting that I have asked Chairman Riley to hold is a meeting where we hear from MARTA itself about what changes to the MARTA Act might be helpful in helping move transit forward in Metro Atlanta. Now, I understand that the 50-50 split has been a long-standing issue between the General Assembly and MARTA. I would ask that that meeting not focus solely on the 50-50 split. I don't want to spend an hour and a half talking only about that. You certainly can bring it up in that meeting. I'm sure that it will come up. But I want to make sure that we address in that first meeting every issue that MARTA wants to bring to the subcommittee's attention with respect to the MARTA Act. So the very first meeting will be a meeting for MARTA to present to the governance subcommittee of MARTOC with respect to potential revisions to the MARTA Act, and then we will also hear from other stakeholders going forward before that subcommittee prepares a report and hopefully actually ultimately a revised or suggested revisions to the MARTA Act itself, actual legislation. Is there any discussion on that point before we move on to the presentation by MARTA? Seeing none, I think we made that pretty clear. That meeting will be scheduled, obviously, it'll be after the legislative session, and it will be a little bit after we have an opportunity to rest after sine die. But it won't be too long after that. I would anticipate that first meeting will occur sometime in early May. All right. How does MARTA? I have asked MARTA to present on 3 issues in particular. First of all, we want to get a picture of where MARTA stands with respect to its budget and with respect to current and projected revenues. Second, because it is a significant topic around the country, I want to get a view of where MARTA stands with regard to its pension obligations. And finally, a major news item, the escalator repair program. I'd like to get a briefing from MARTA on that. So I don't know how you all want to structure your presentation, but I will leave that up to you. And there is a PowerPoint handout, I think, in everyone's folder.
Representative Jacobs.
Mr. Durrett.
Let me introduce myself. My name is Jim Durrett. I serve on the board of MARTA as a representative of DeKalb County. This past December, I was elected by the other members of the board to be the chairman of the board for the year 2011. And on behalf of my board, one of whom is here, Janine Miller, the executive director of Greta. Let me say thank you for the opportunity to present to you. Representative Jacobs, I also want to say that we very much appreciate the very constructive and proactive approach that you have taken, you and other members of this committee, to establish an open and an honest and a constructive working relationship where you can get the information that you need to make the decisions. for how we can assure that the public gets a good return on its investment in this transit system. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with you. I'll turn it over to Dr. Scott, and I'm here to answer any questions that you may have. I will let you know that I have a 12 o'clock speaking engagement at the Commerce Club to talk about MARTA. So if this runs to that length of time, you will understand why I need to leave.
All right. On that point, before Dr. Scott begins, and then Dr. Scott, I'd like you to begin by introducing any staff that you might want to introduce to the committee. But on the point of the board, I would like for this committee to institute a project of having a member of this committee on a rotating basis attend a MARTA board meeting. I started that actually it was your board retreat in January after taking the reins of this committee. Representative Riley, I believe, went in February. We've fallen down on the job a little bit in March and April because the legislative session, well, we've been a little bit busy. But I would hope that we will resume that in May. And so I don't want to conscript any members who might not have the time to make it to a board meeting, but if you want to participate in that, that is open to all members of the committee. Please come see me after the meeting is over with so that I know that you're interested in it, and we will assign you to a MARTA board meeting to attend on behalf of MARTOC. We will you are eligible for a committee day for that, but I would ask that in return for that you report to me as chair via email, and Representative Riley did this, on what happened at the MARTA board meeting on that day. So that and that is intended to strengthen the relationship between the MARTA board and MARTOC. Any discussion on that, Representative Mitchell?
Actually, Mr. Chairman, I just had a question while we still have Chairman Durrett here.
Certainly.
Being from DeKalb County, I want to first of all congratulate you on being the chair. I don't know your background or anything like that, and I just wanted you to take a little time to describe your background as well. I know most of the board members, and I didn't have the pleasure of meeting you, and I'd appreciate that.
Yes, sir, Mr. Mitchell. I'm an Atlanta native. My day job, such as it is, is I run the Buckhead Community Improvement District. It's one of the CIDs that operate in the metropolitan Atlanta region. Prior to that, I ran a nonprofit called the Livable Communities Coalition, focused on trying to change the development patterns in metropolitan Atlanta and to make wise decisions about our land use and transportation investments. Before that, I ran the Urban Land Institute's Atlanta District Council, working with real estate developers and land planners and architects, the people who create the built environment, to come up with the very best that community can produce. And before that, I've done some other nonprofit things, and I started my work career in Atlanta as a professional geologist.
Welcome.
And I live in DeKalb County. I have a wife and 2 kids, one of whom is off at college, and the other one is hopefully going to be off to college in just a matter of months.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Stoner.
Just real quickly, unfortunately, I mentioned I may have to leave a little early, but as a veteran of this committee, I want to thank you for having an agenda. As veterans of this committee,
and it is not a hidden agenda either.
Yes, and I just wanted to make a comment on that. Some of us up here who are veterans were commenting on the fact that it's nice to have an agenda, and so I just want to say that I like the tone and attitude that this committee has started off under your leadership. I just want to state that, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Senator, are you, since you have to leave early, are you interested in participating in going and representing MARTOC at a MARTA board meeting?
Yes, I am.
All right.
Yes, I am.
Also, I note we have the chairman of Senate Transportation here, Senator Mullis, who I'd like to recognize you to introduce yourself to the crowd, and Representative Gardner as well. Senator Mullis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just a concerned citizen and glad to be here today and support Dr. Scott and, of course, this committee, and let me know how I can serve you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Representative Gardner, what's your number down there?
another concerned citizen. And I 11.
Or 11.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I guess everyone can already hear me, but I am another concerned citizen and certainly a supporter of MARTA and a member of the House Transportation Committee, and here to help however I can.
All right, Dr. Scott, if you'd like to start first with introducing any of your staff who you'd like to introduce to the Oversight Committee.
Chairman Jacobs and members of the committee, it's absolutely a pleasure and an honor to be here today. And it is a pleasure to be able to introduce the members of the staff. You're going to be hearing very little from me. My staff will laugh, though they should pop up as need be. But I really do, we have a tremendous asset here in terms of not only the infrastructure that is this ninth largest public transit system in the country, but a tremendous resource in terms of the people who are at the MARTA system and who are the ones who are responsible for really making it happen. And so what I'm going to do, and they'll be making presentations today, many of them, but you'll have Ted Boster, who's here. He is the Chief of Business Support Services. Ted is a 35-year veteran from the New York MTA, and in fact headed the entire bus division and everything over at the New York MTA for many, many years. And he is our Chief of Business Support Services. Will be giving the intro presentation in terms of the overall finances here at MARTA. You have Davis Allen. Davis is our Chief Financial Officer. He will be assisting Ted in the presentation. He is actually very close to retirement, unfortunately, and he's been with MARTA for many, many years, but actually began in the banking industry. And so we're extremely proud and pleased to have Davis, and he has been with this authority for the better part of about 15, 20 years, okay? Johnny Keith heads our internal audit division. Johnny is here. He reports directly to the board, but he has a dotted line reporting responsibility to the general manager. Also someone who is going to be retiring shortly. One of the reasons that Johnny is here, not only in his capacity as just as you would say, the internal auditor, but many of the things you'll be hearing about in terms of elevators and escalators and things of that nature, he performs not only a financial function, but also performs oversight, if you will, as requested in operational and performance areas. We're moving back over into this area here. Dwight Farrell is our Deputy General Manager and Chief Operating Officer. He will be making the presentation specifically on escalators and elevators. Dwight brings this is his second time through MARTA. He brings extensive experience in this industry, and he's been at SEPTA in Philadelphia. He was responsible for helping to bring the commuter rail system up in the Austin area, in Houston, Texas, in terms of light rail. And so we are, one of the things we've attempted to do in the recombining, if you will, of this committee, MARTA has traditionally we've been on a heavy rail platform, and what I have chosen to do in staffing is to not only do heavy rail, but to make sure that we brought people here who had the full range of rail background and experience, understanding the fact that both commuter rail as well as light rail and streetcar expansion would be a new place for us to go in terms of the system, in terms of growing this system. Georgetta Gregory comes to us. She is the head of safety. Georgetta came to us from the California Public Utilities Commission. We are extremely proud of the fact that when the Secretary of Transportation recently, for the first time in this industry, named a national group to in fact head transportation safety in the rail area, which has never been done, and that happened as a function of the accidents at WMATA and Metrolink in California. Georgetta, who heads our safety division, as well as Rich Krisak, who is our head of rail, who is not here today, are two nationally of the 20 members across the country that were named by the Secretary of Transportation directly to be a part of that group. And we're extremely proud to have that kind of capability and expertise here in our region. Backing up White, you have here, we're coming through, this is all elevators and escalators and rail cars back here. So we have Nick Owens over here who heads all of the division that handles all of the rail car maintenance. Tim Eason, who's here. Tim, we had not had, prior to this administration, we had not had a manager over what we call vertical systems. We have 149 escalators in the system, and we have 112 elevators in the system. We're a lot of big things that move, and making sure that we have vertical systems and people who truly have the expertise in that area. We contract that out, which is not really quite usual in the industry, but the point is that we own the asset. We have the responsibility. You can contract things out, but you, in fact, maintain the responsibility. You cannot abrogate that. You maintain the responsibility for its appropriate functioning. And then Gary Free. Gary heads our facilities area, and Tim backs up Georgetta. He's one of the key members of our safety team. Liz O'Neill, who is our general counsel, who is our chief counsel, in-house MARTA, and of course Scott Haggard and Rhonda. Where's Rhonda? Who are our external affairs function. So this is the MARTA team that is here this morning. Oh, and Lyle Harris. How could I have missed you, Lyle? Okay, in external affairs. So what I'm going to do, I will be. I feel conversant in all of the areas. I certainly am not the subject matter expert in every one of them, but I try to kind of occupy the ground I stand on. So what I'd like to do is to turn it over to this point to Ted Basta, and he will go through with Davis on an overview of the financial situation at MARTA, a bit of how we're really trying to approach being able to walk and jump and understand there are a lot of unknowns at the federal level, the state level, the regional and local level, and then he'll be followed by Davis Allen, who will speak about our pensions, and then White, who will talk about our situation with elevators next.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, committee members. I must tell you I tried to have the session canceled for technical reasons. This did not work. I was told that that was not possible, so I'll work through it anyway. Thank you for the opportunity to be here to discuss.
Oh, and if I can, let me, before you go on, if any member, as we go through the presentation, if any member has any questions or comments, just hit your button, and at an opportune time, I'll be sure to recognize you. Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. What we'd like to do this morning briefly is to take you through what has occurred over the last year in terms of our financial planning, what has happened from an actual point of view, and where we're headed in terms of this year's budget cycle for fiscal 12 and on. Our story really begins with this particular chart. We've used this on a number of occasions, but the column to the far left represents what Dr. Scott saw when she first walked into this agency in terms of sales tax projections. I must point out that over 47% of the resources that are available to MARTA come from sales tax. And as one of the items that will be discussed under the governance activity, up to this point, it has been sales tax has been based on a 50-50 split, half to operations, half to capital. However, when that first revised forecast came in, the economic downturn throughout the nation produced a hit for us of $1.5 billion over 10 years. On average, that's $150 million a year drop in revenues, and that's an extremely difficult type of thing to deal with. It got progressively worse. There was another reforecast in July of 2009 in which another roughly $300 million was dropped from the forecast. These are the kinds of things that had to be dealt with immediately because it had immediate consequences to the operating and capital budgets. What you'll hear is that specifically in 2009, there were major internal initiatives to reduce costs. Jobs were frozen, hiring was stopped, vacancies were not backfilled, all but essential travel and expenses were cut. That was leading into the fiscal 10 budget process. You may recall at that time, for fiscal 10, there was the first fare increase that occurred in over 9 years. We went from a base fare of $1.75 to a base fare of $2. The longer-term view for fares at that point was to keep the base fare constant, but change the monthly and weekly pricing patterns of fares. In any event, leading into fiscal 11, which is really where I want to go, there was some good news, and it was the first good news that had occurred in quite some time, and that was yet another reforecast of sales tax. What it indicated was through 2012, there would be an increase of about $370 million in sales tax. Now, that's a considerable amount of money, but it still left the agency, relative to where we sat in December of 2008, $1.4 billion in the hole. So it was good news, but not great news. Now, when dealing with transit deficits, there's really only 4 ways to address them. One is through internal productivity and cost containment, things you can do yourself to initiate efficiencies and economies. You can identify new revenue sources. Those would be such things as advertising and the like on the system. You can change your fare and parking structure, which we did in fiscal 10 and 11. And then ultimately, the last place one can go, since 75% of our expenses are associated with labor and benefits, you must go to transit service levels. When you affect transit service levels, you also impact all of the administrative overhead that supports those activities. I'll get into that in just a second. But those are the 4 basic ways to address the issue within transit. I mentioned the change in fares in fiscal 10. You can see on this chart, the far left, we went to a $2 base fare, and we began to look at the multiples. If you shift your eyes to the fiscal 11 column, where it says monthly pass, you'll see a small number, 34. What that is the multiple that is used to price the monthly pass. So it's 34 trips times $2 gives you $68. That multiple is currently one of the lowest in the country, and that is a product of not having done fare change up till this point since 2000. Our goal is to increase the multiple, become more competitive as it relates to the rest of the nation. The single highest multiple that is employed that we're aware of is in Los Angeles. They use a multiple of 50. There are differences because of the state of economy and relative costs to live here versus Los Angeles, but they are on a 50 multiple. And the original plan, if you follow along that line, was to keep the base fare the same in 12, increase the multiple to 38, and then hold that multiple constant once we got into 13 at 40. That was the general plan, and that's how we entered fiscal 11 on that basis. Now, what you see in front of you are the net effects of the internal cost containment and the changes in service levels. The reductions in bus hours, service hours, was over 10%. The reduction in rail was over 14%. Mobility was the only service that received an increase going into fiscal 11. That is associated for the most part with our zero denial rate, which is a federal regulation. It is also the fastest growing segment of the transit service here in Atlanta and really nationwide as the boomers begin to utilize this service more and more. Additionally, you can see that
It's for seniors and disabled.
senior and disabled. The net impact on positions at MARTA was a drop of 734. In addition to that, there were over 300 actual layoffs which occurred starting in July. And you can read the balance of the impacts, reductions in fleet size, the closing of, you've heard a lot of discussion around the closing of some of the bathrooms in stations, in reducing the number of station agents that are in and around the system, as well as some other administrative changes. This was the internal way to reduce costs, and this had a value, an overall value of about $60 million. And I'll get into that in just a second.
And I think I just want to make a couple of points here. And Ted's shown 2 First, the first set of boxes were the 4 boxes in terms of transit deficit reduction strategies. I don't care where you are. There's only 4 ways to do it: internal cost containment and productivity, new revenue sources, and Senator Butler and many others, thank you so much. That's why SB 89 made such a big difference. We were able to, in fact, wind up starting to do some things with concessions, which we will be able to expand on. Then you've got over here fare levels, and you've got transit service levels. Now, I'm going to come over here. A transit system, at the end of the day, what drives a transit service budget is hours and miles. It's service. Now, that brings with it predominantly service gets you labor, and that's why when you look at the shape of any transit budget, I pick a transit budget, I've worked 7 of them. When I pick a transit service budget up, I know somewhere between 68 to about 75% is going to be in labor and fringe, pure and simple. So when you're talking about having to take big dollars out of a transit budget, I'm not talking a budget like ours. 20 million it's hard, but you can do it. But when you start talking about 100 million, 50 million, 75 million, there is absolutely no way to do that without impacting hours, miles. Hours and miles drive your staffing, they drive your vehicles, they drive your locations, what do you need in terms of infrastructure, and at the end of the day, that's what you got to work with. And so that's why this is so critical. They're the building blocks of a transit budget are hours and miles, okay, which drive your people, drive your equipment, drive your facilities, and drive all that. So that's what this is trying to also depict. Now, the other thing I want to be clear about is on MARTA Mobility Service. It is a wonderful service. It is the service that we have that is required by the Americans with Disabilities Act. It came about as in roughly about 1991. And what wound up happening was that the Federal Transit Administration, U.S. Department of Transportation, I will be honest, largely because the traditional transit industry had been pretty bullheaded when it came to making accommodations to make it possible to have accessible service for seniors and for individuals who did not use traditional service. But along with it came a series of ADA regulations, and if you receive federal funding, which most big transit systems do, so I want to make that point, you have an absolute mandate that you have to provide what is called paratransit or complimentary service within 3/4 of a mile of any service that you run that is fixed route. And under the federal regulations, they require that you, once again, it only happens if you accept federal funding, but we do, okay, and it is an unfunded mandate. And if, in fact, you run that service, you have to run that service such that you budget for 0 trip denials. So you do not have an option of skimming it, okay? And literally they'll call you foul, and you can have your funding can all be. So given your funding can all be subject to stop if in fact they find that you have blatantly been out there not budgeting appropriately. So let's fast forward to our region and the demographics in the country. Baby boomers, rising population in terms of age and individuals who have difficulty in terms of utilizing fixed route. I only say this because paratransit service has been the fastest growing service in our system. Over the last 10 years, it's been about an average of about 13%. It is extremely expensive service to run. And so some of the things that, in fact, Representative Geisinger has been such a big champion of when you see John Keyes talking about across the board looking at human and social services coordination and ways of doing things smarter, that's a big area for all of us.
All right.
Now I'll turn it back to you.
A question from Representative Geisinger.
Dr. Scott, are you still having problems with ride dumping?
Yes. Yes.
Would you explain that to the committee, please?
What it is because, and Representative, you're on it. What it is because we have federal funding, extensive federal assistance that we receive. And because of the fact that we have the obligation to, in fact, wind up providing for this service, there are many other groups that are out there, and they can be doing the Lord's work, but at the end of the day, they know that an operator like me has no choice but to have to provide the service. So where you would normally say, hey, why don't we all get together and just figure it out, and everybody does the fair thing, Well, quite candidly, it's very easy for somebody to say, you know what, I'm having problems meeting my budget. And I know that I've been providing these kinds of things and helping here and there, but you know what? I can step back, cut that out of my budget, and you know Mikey's going to still have to wind up picking it up because they have a federal requirement to have to do so, okay? So that the important thing, and it is what it is, and it happens in community after community, so literally what can wind up happening is that MARTA winds, or a MARTA type agency, winds up having to wind up picking up trips that normally others would have been trying to help support, but they really don't have to at the end of the day. If in fact they get pinched, they can just say, look, let Mikey have to wind up taking it and you'll have to take the cost. Because you can't avoid the obligation. So having everybody work together so that we all understand what's happening and do it in a very adult and really upfront way so that we really maximize pulling all the resources together is the smartest thing to do. And it takes a lot of collaboration and cooperation to do that.
If I may, Mr. Chairman.
Representative
One
Geisinger.
further question.
Yes, sir.
What is the disparity in the dollars between the two? Aren't they getting paid about $35 where you're getting paid about
I will
what?
tell you, I can't say right off the bat, but it's about the difference of we're about $35, $36 and a trip at this point in time for the paratransit trips that for the paratransit service.
That's the cost, but what are you receiving?
I want to tell you that it's about $360. We're receiving about $360 per trip.
$3.60.
$3.60.
Yeah.
So are those other folks that are dumping on you receiving the $35?
Yes. Yes, they are. And I'll have,
It may not be 35.
it's not quite 35, but they're receiving much more than the 360.
Our legal says it's $14 they are receiving per trip.
14?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Senator Stoner.
Dr. Scott, I think something that needs to be clarified, and correct me if I'm wrong, you are limited by federal law on what you can charge.
Absolutely. The
And
most
just make that understand why you're not able to recover is because
Right.
federal law states, I think, if I'm correct, you cannot more than twice what your going rate is.
You can only go up to 2 times
Right.
the whatever your base fare is. You are precluded from charging any more for these services than 2 times. So one of the discussions that we'll have, and I'm trying in terms of the MARTA Act, whenever one starts talking about fare box recovery or cost recovery of a system, how much should the user wind up paying for the service? And there's no one right way on that, but I will defy, in most instances, paratransit service, which is extremely expensive, it's essential service, but it's extremely expensive to provide. If you can and it's the rising demographic, if you can wind up getting a 5% fare box recovery off of paratransit service almost anywhere in this country, you're doing very well. So when one starts talking about, oh, I want you to have a 35 or 40% fare box recovery without crossing over to understand the economics behind the overall what's driving the expenses in transit, those things sound good, but they don't work, they don't pin out.
Well, I think the point is made is that you have a direction from the federal government
You got it.
that you're required to provide this at the same time, which is an unfunded mandate, and at the same time you're told you can't charge beyond this
You got
amount.
You got it. You can
And
only go twice. You can
So
only go twice.
they're getting you at both ends in a sense.
Yes. And once again, this is not, just a MARTA or whatever, but it has probably been one of the biggest issues at the overall, it's just some of those things that have changed in the context when MARTA was first created. These kinds of rules didn't exist. And so that's why your look at the MARTA Act and what the context is today, it's not a right or wrong, but back in the late 60s, early 70s, these things didn't exist. And so this background changed, but the rules and the laws have not been updated to reflect what is now the new operating environment within which we work.
All right. You can continue. I do want to recognize Senator Fort has joined us, also a member of the committee. Thank you.
Thank you. And that was exactly what I was going to say. Again, to quickly walk you through, again, as a foundational piece of information, the current operating budget for fiscal 11, as you can see here, 47% of the revenues are coming from sales tax. And when you have a over-dependency on any one type of source, when there's, especially sales tax, when there is an economic downturn, the first thing to be hit is generally sales tax, and then passenger revenue. So those two items form the bulk of the revenues that MARTA receives on an annual basis. In terms of expenses, as I mentioned before, roughly 75% is dedicated to salaries, wages, and benefits. As Dr. Scott indicated, the vast majority of that is based on hours, miles, and vehicle requirements as they appear in the scheduled services that we provide. When we began the process for 11, and I'll show that chart a little bit further down, we were facing a $120 million shortfall for fiscal 11. And at that point, there were a number of alternatives that we were looking at. One included a 33% reduction in rail, a 33% reduction in bus, 20% reduction in rail, the elimination of some 1,200 positions, which would have been about 30% of the workforce, as well as a number of other administrative and internal reductions. The capital budget also is dependent upon sales tax. The way it currently operates is 50% goes to operating, 50% goes to capital. What has ensued, though, with the temporary lift of the 50-50, which we are very appreciative of, I just want to mention that there's a piece in your handouts that describes some of the background of the 50-50 and what its elimination has meant to us in the very short term. And the reason I mention that is what we've had to do is scale back both the operating budget and the capital budget. And the capital budget is now solely concerned with state of good repair, safety regulatory, and those kinds of things that keep the moving parts, as Dr. Scott mentioned before, moving in the night. There's very little for expansion. There's very little for planning for expansion. And we hope that that will change through the Investment Act. Where we stood at the creation of the fiscal 11 budget, what we faced was, as I mentioned before, you'll see that highlighted in yellow, a $120 million deficit. What ultimately got approved by the Board of Directors was a budget that now carried a $69 million deficit, so we cut it roughly in half. That was the result of two things. One, the internal economies that we just discussed, a bit better forecast on sales tax, and then ultimately the ability to use reserves for the operating budget that were at the point prior to the change in the legislation only for capital purposes. And that is one of the immediate impacts that we received benefit from going into fiscal 11. Under the original 11 plan, we would have fully exhausted MARTA's operating and capital reserves by the middle of fiscal 13. We would have had nowhere to go other than to downsize the agency to absolutely meet revenue streams. The ability to now make it through fiscal 13 is what occurred by having a fiscal 11 budget at a $69 million deficit. So 69 in 11, 60 in 12, and roughly 60 in 13, which would get us to a point past the Investment Act referendum. This gives you a broader description of those impacts. Again, if you look at the yellow line, at the end of fiscal 11, there were $203 million in operating and capital reserves. 25 was used in fiscal 10, which left a balance of 178. And as you can see on this track, by the end of 13, we would have been $13 million in the red. We would have had to find, to balance the budget, $13 million. And we would have no alternative in 14, 15, or 16 other than to cut the budget significantly. That was, again, the plan going into fiscal 11. Now, in preparation for this budget year, two things have changed. We're looking at, first of all, a 3-year financial plan, which would be through 12, 13, and 14, and we're also taking the broader look of a 5-year plan through 16. We are looking to stabilize MARTA over that time period by a number of approaches, which I'll get into in a second. And we're also looking to position MARTA for future growth through the regionalization of transit in Georgia. The first step and the first good news that we received in this process was a revised sales tax forecast. We received that this past February. And as you'll note, the box to the far right indicates that through 16, there's an increase of $155 million projected in sales tax receipts. That is the first good news that we've received since last year around the same time. That continues in the outer years, to total $414 million, but we're certainly not looking not yet anyway, that far ahead. Now, without a 50-50 restriction lift, that $155 million would need to be split half to capital, half to operating. With the current provision through 13 of lifting that provision, we have flexibility in assigning dollars where they're needed, whether it be capital or operating or a combination of the two. What our board has preliminarily suggested as part of the budget process is that only that excess is available for assignment to operations, but not 100% of that difference. There will be a portion of that ultimately assigned into reserves so that we can begin to build that back. As it stands, we have a structural $60 million deficit, as I showed you earlier, on the operating side, and a standing $40 to $50 million shortfall on the capital side. That's $100 million, and if something goes boom in the night, it is not responsible not to have a reserve pool in case. The important thing to note, though, is that with the permanent lifting of the 50-50, those decisions would be made by the board and not by law.
So did I hear correctly that we're in essence at zero in reserves?
Under
No.
the current track, by fiscal 13, if it wasn't for this, we were at zero.
Okay, all right, but that is reversed.
It's in the process of being reversed as we speak.
All right.
And the first step in that, the first assistance in that, was this new revenue stream, which is significant.
So I think the pieces that I want to, if you could just bear with us, and if it gets to be too much, just tell me. The piece that we want to make real clear is that what we've wound up doing is we said, look, we have got to wind up going into that internal productivity cost containment budget portion, and we've taken almost $100 million worth of cost out of this agency, and a lot of it was just plain old real cost, okay, and we've done that over the last couple of years. We've also moved aggressively in the area of fares. We've increased the base fare, and in fact we have aggressively increased the multiples, and we're still, what the budget that they're getting ready to talk about now, we're talking about recommending to the board to make another adjustment in terms of fares. One of the things we're also looking to do, the next platform for fares needs to be a variable based or distance and time based fare system, which it will take money to get to, and we have put that on our unconstrained list for 277. But when you get there, you want to have positioned yourself with your fares being as good as they need to be so you can make that transition. And we know that we need to do another hit in terms of on the fare side of the house. We have tried to be moving as quickly as we can, but we know there's more work to be done in terms of new revenue generation. And what we have been trying to do is to stop the slash and burn at MARTA so that we could at least get to a point for another 3-year period of time where we could hold the transit service level so we didn't have to keep going out to the public and cutting, because our business is providing service, okay? So that's, and in this world of unknown, that's what we've been trying to balance so that we were not, in fact, just every single year out there doing nutty things. Now, how have we been able to do that as well is you also have a piece in your background package. Labor costs for us are critical. Now, I don't want to mislead this committee at all that we've got folks that are running in big high labor costs over here, because quite candidly we don't. And there's some information that we have provided in terms of what our wage rates are compared to other wage rates around the country, and quite candidly they are not high at all, okay? However, you have to deal with the economics that you have. So the point of it is this: we also had to settle a labor contract because we had not had a labor contract. It had really been deferred for 2 years. And I am here to say that we did settle that contract this last year, and we settled it through June of 2013. And so literally, MARTA employees who are on wages will have 5 years of zero. No increase in terms, there was nothing that we gave back, and we settled the lowest cost labor contract in the country with 5 zeros. And in fact, the average that we've had in terms of increase over the last 5 years has been over the last 10 years has been 1.54%, when the national average in terms of transit labor contracts has been 3.06%. So I defy anyone to talk about the fact that there is bloating going on in terms of what we've been doing in terms of labor rates over at MARTA, that we do not know how to manage that. And I give a lot of credit to Amalgamated Transit Union Local 732, because quite candidly, for most of them, they can't go and talk to their counterparts who are all dealing with the same kind of economics around this country and talk to them about what it's like to sit on top of 5 zeros. Now, in addition to that, what staff have kind of glossed over is that I think I will probably be the first general manager who will probably be able to leave here and say for 5 years, we've had, for the last 2.5 years, we've had 10 days of mandated furloughs from me all the way down. We have increased health care cost contributions for all employee groups, and we're still on furloughs. And everything that you see in terms of these budget projections is zeros in terms of any increases for any group of management. I will not and have not accepted any bonuses or adjustments in my compensation, and I'm not talking about my compensation. I'm well compensated. But I have not and will not, as long as the people in this organization are not able to get it. We have increased health care contributions on both non-represented as well as represented employees. And that's what you see is taking place at this organization in terms of being able to make it hold together, if you will, through this period that we all appreciate as a difficult period. And so all of these numbers got 10-day furloughs in them. They've got increases in health care contributions. They've got zeros in terms of wage increases. And that's how we're looking at being able to make it through not only where we've come from over the last 2.5 year period of time, but what you see in terms of the projections that get us through the 2013, the 2014s, and the 2015.
Representative Geisinger.
Dr. Scott.
Yes, sir.
Since we're talking about fares, what happened to the study in regards to distance fares?
It has gone much beyond the study phase. What we have done is that we are on a path, and we budgeted for this in our capital program, skimpy as it was, to in fact be able to do all of the design work to wind up getting us to variable base fares. But the commitment we made was this, and that work will conclude within the next year. But in order to actually be able to do the change requires major software adjustments and everything, upgrades in all the equipment we have out there. And that's really about a $30 million price tag. And we said when there are new revenue sources, we'll be ready to put it out on the street as soon as there is a revenue source to pay for that. So we did in fact wind up budgeting and actually have been proceeding with that work to do all the design work on that.
Well, at some point, I'm sure we'd like to see what you've got so far.
It'd be a pleasure, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. And so, and there's some there's some other pieces that are in here in terms of that we just went through. And if there are any questions, just please, because I know we're glossing through a lot on what are the pieces of a transit budget that are on pages 7 and 8. How much comes from fares? How much comes from the federal government? When you see things like preventive maintenance, you know, that I just want you to understand that the federal government, once again, some of you do. When I first started in this industry 30 years ago, it was not uncommon at all for the federal government to pay up to 70-80% of a transit system's operating costs. They changed that in 1998. In 1998, categorically across the board, all public transit systems that were what they called mid-size or bigger, and mid-size is defined as any transit system that serves an urbanized area of more than 250,000 people, categorically lost all operating assistance. And so what you have is an ability to be able to utilize capital dollars that you receive that are eligible for preventive maintenance. And preventive maintenance is no administrative salaries, it's no transportation, it's no operators. You can't pay for a BEV out of that or an operator behind a bus. You can only pay for individuals who are involved in the preservation of the asset. And so you can only pay for maintenance and facilities personnel. And when you make the decision to utilize those federal formula dollars for preventive maintenance as opposed to building capital, that is your choice as an agency, but there are no new dollars. And so that money that you see in that one plug that talks about preventive maintenance at some significant level, $50-some million a year, is literally MARTA's decision to utilize capital dollars for preventive maintenance as an offset on the operating side of the house. You'll see the thing in terms of fares. People may ask the question, well, how much does the user of the MARTA system pay of what it costs to run MARTA? And that number now is up to roughly about 29%, and you see that reflected on your chart. And I will say to you that that is an extremely respectable number given the demographics of our system. And that is that we still run a service that's in a fairly low density area. You would not expect us to be like a New York or a San Francisco, but I will tell you that that fare box recovery number comports very well with the systems of the parts of the country we compare ourselves with, like the Denvers and the Charlottes and the Portlands and the Seattles and the Utahs and the Houstons and the Dallases. I will tell you absolutely, put me on the truth-o-meter, that if you compared MARTA to any of those systems, I invite you to do so, that you will find that they would love to have that 29% in terms of fare box recovery of the ones that I've mentioned, and the ones which folks like to compare us to.
Two things from that, Dr. Scott.
Yes, sir.
First, with respect to the 29% fare box recovery, I would like to see MARTA's comparison of MARTA versus its peers in terms of where things stand with regard to fare box recovery. I'm not sitting here saying that 29% is a good, bad, or ugly rate. I'm just saying I would like to see how that compares with the systems that MARTA chooses as its peers.
Be happy to, and in fact, the brochure that you have that's on efficiency and effectiveness, which utilizes national transit data, has quite a bit of that comparative information in there. But we'll be more than happy to provide much more than that as well, sir.
All right. Now, with respect to the study of distance fares,
yes, sir.
Is there a consultant's report that exists at this time?
Oh gosh, yes. Okay,
a digestible consultant's report.
Be very happy to, yes, and we will provide that.
What I think for a future meeting, I'd like to get that information sooner rather than later, or get a digestible consultant's report on that. But I think that also will be a topic for a future meeting, and so you may also want to think about or present to us early, what action steps are possible or impossible under the current under the current set of circumstances, what might need to change in order to make something happen.
Be very happy to
All right.
do so.
I've got lights over here. Representative Mitchell, I think you were first, 19.
Mr. Chairman, my question has been asked and answered.
Thank you.
Senator Fort.
Dr. Scott, it's good to see you again. I see you 2 days
Yes,
in a
sir.
row.
2 in a row. Yes, sir.
Infinitely lucky. I've been sitting through your budget briefings to this committee for a long time. I think longer than anybody who now serves on the committee, and I think you're the third general manager who's given those briefings to us since I've been on Martoc. And I have heard some of the details, but it seems to me that what we're being told, and I'm looking at the big picture, is that y'all are about broke, and that the prospects for being in the black, other than cutting a bare bones system or increasing fares to the point where you're going to run off more of the people who are not MARTA or transit dependent, that your situation is dire. Is that correct?
Yes, it is, sir. And one of the things we're trying to highlight is that we're not shying away from. Now, I'm not saying we're perfect, and in fact, one of the things our board is even looking at, and we've even recommended very much, is let's do a complete efficiency review, because we've taken a lot of cost out of this agency. We had to take it as big hunks. I'm just telling you. From walking in the door, it was like, there is no surplus here. We have got to take some drastic actions. But we are a large organization, so to come back and fine-tune that, but the reality is that this is not going to right itself by simply cutting, okay? And so when you hear us talking about very candidly that we support trying to get to the next place in the next generation of transit in this region, Fulton and DeKalb County and the city of Atlanta cannot continue by themselves to support what is going to be a robust transit system for this entire region. It's just not doable, okay? So that's what, so you're exactly right.
And that segues, Mr.
You
Chair,
got
to
it.
my follow-up. And that is, I mean, in your guy just told us that if there's a hiccup, like a Washington, D.C. accident hiccup, which has safety implications that rolled across this country for transit systems, when that train went off that track,
Right.
it reverberated back here to Atlanta. Y'all had to do certain things. So
Almost certainly.
If we have a hiccup, all bets are off.
Oh,
I mean, y'all may have to go to 4, 5, 6 days. So my question is, if that is the fiscal implications of what you're telling us this morning, y'all need new revenue streams. Do you have? I mean, you can look at all the efficiencies you want to, but where the new revenue streams to make sure that MARTA is the 21st century system that we all want? I mean, where's the money going to come from?
Well, I'm certainly hoping that that's why I say this 277, and I know that it is not the end-all, be-all, okay, but certainly getting new revenue in here is critical, and how that new revenue winds up getting parceled, if you will. Some portion for expansion, we understand that, but there has got to be a significant portion of that that goes to state of good repair for the existing core infrastructure. And so that a combination of, there's a lot of different things. We need to hold costs down, but I will just tell you off the bat that getting some significant new revenue, and it's got to be beyond the 1 penny that's out there, is absolutely essential in order to be able to be one of those key blocks, if you will. I want to be able to do public-private partnerships, and we'll be innovative, and we'll do all of that, but the bottom line is these are big dollars, and there's got to be some new revenue that comes in to support it.
The only other thing I'd want to say, Mr. Chair, and at this point, is when we have the referendum bill, the regional sales tax law, says that MARTA shall not be authorized to use any of the proceeds from the special district transportation sales and use tax for expenses of maintenance and operation of such portions of the system that's in place as of January 1st, 2011. I mean, it seems to me that is a barrier. It is a barrier. It is a high barrier to what you are talking about, because you ain't getting a penny. Excuse my grammatical sentence, but you ain't getting a penny. And so that's why I'm entirely ambivalent about that referendum. If MARTA cannot use it to get out from under the hole, if you cannot use it for employees that have taken 5 zeros, then I have a great deal of concern about that referendum, and I think my constituents will as well.
Let's see. All right. Do we have more on the financial presentation?
Very brief.
Okay. Why don't you wrap that up, and then I know Representative Mitchell has questions related to that. There might be others as well. Go ahead.
This particular chart captures many of the comments Dr. Scott has already made about the foundation around which the 5-year financial plan is built, most significantly the zeros that you heard about, no expansion, no growth, steady state service, and everything under the assumption that there are no booms in the night. With our board, the newly reconstituted board, we are integrating a variety of financial presentations. We did not mean to overwhelm you with this particular sheet. The only thing we have it in here for is to illustrate we're doing various models on fares, various models on sales tax, and the implications on holding budgets steady through 16. We understand that that is not a reasonable approach to take. However, that is the basic information that we'll be moving forward with our board and giving them options on how to progress both the 12 and through the 16 time period. Dr. Scott mentioned some of the other deficit reduction steps that we're taking. Those include cost containment, indexing the fares perhaps to either a CPI or a defined fare box recovery ratio, continuing with the efforts to eliminate the restrictions. We will be advancing to our board the notion to have an independent review of the organizational efficiencies. This is one of the outgrowths of and one of the comments from the prior MARTOC committee sessions of last year. And we're also looking to maximize.
And what is that independent review? Do we have any idea by whom that is going to be performed at this point, or it's just a recommendation?
We don't know who would perform it, but literally in the audit committee that is coming up, we have a requirement to do a management audit. This was just discussed in the audit committee to expand it from a traditional audit, management audit, to actually be a operational and performance review on a lean organizational model. The scope has been developed, and that is going before the audit committee in April, and then at that point they put it out on the street, and then people would propose on it. It would be a request for proposal. It would have to be selected by no later than about August, because that first hit has to be done. The first phase of it would need to be completed by December, and so that is actually underway as we speak.
So the scope would go before the audit committee this month?
Yes, absolutely.
And Mr. Durrett, when is that meeting? April 20th? Okay.
And this is we recommended, well, we just had this conversation. In fact, I recommended to the board that it be much beyond the traditional management audit, that it literally be an audit that was really around looking at performance, operational, and a lean, what we call kind of a lean organizational review. Like I said, we have taken a lot of cost out the agency, but we're a 35-year agency. I will make no bones about it. Taking a real forensic where you go through department by function, what can be outsourced, that kind of thing. Those kinds of things have not been done at that level at the agency, and I'm really trying to get us in fight and wait, if you will, so that as we make this next generation turn to the new expanded, and I hope we get there, that we go into it as lean and mean as we can as MARTA.
Is that proposed scope that's in writing available now, or?
We have a draft. It's been hitting it. Yes, sir.
I don't want to get in the way of your draft, but I would like to ask, as it's presented to the board members, that it also be presented in particular to me, but also to, or get it to me, and I will get it to all members of MARTOC.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you.
So the basis around which the operating budget will be presented, of course, what is approved is fiscal 12, but we hope to have a fiscal 12 through 16 financial projection plan in front of our board so that they can make their evaluations, which of course will include some recommendations on fare increases, some recommendations on the sales tax forecasts, as well as any internal efficiencies that we can find and recommend through the budget process immediately. And what Dr. Scott was referencing with this study would be for incorporation into the fiscal 13 budget program, where in fact if something is found for implementation. The capital plan, as I mentioned, also has taken its...
Before we move on to that, let me also ask, back on the slide that deals with deficit reduction strategies, under maximize existing and generate new revenue streams, I was wondering if someone can, and this is, I think, going to be a subject for the governance subcommittee and as it reviews the MARTA Act, but I was hoping that someone could just briefly talk about the MARTA Act restriction on MARTA, for example, performing repairs on other systems buses, but only being able to recover their costs. That was of interest to me at that January board retreat that I attended, and I thought it might be worthwhile for someone to at least just mention that so that everybody here understands what it is and why potentially it's an issue.
Good morning.
Another one?
Essentially, the MARTA Act does restrict the, when we're contracting for services, it prohibits MARTA from contracting for anything other than rail services, for anything other than bus services. It also restricts, as you already mentioned, the amount that could be recouped. So we cannot make a profit from those services. It is just that we recoup the costs that are incurred by providing the services.
And so as a result, those services generally are not provided, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
All right, Ms. O'Neill, right?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Back to where we were.
Yes. In terms of the capital plan, it also has been impacted by the decline in sales tax revenues. You can see at its height, we were expending somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 million, $325 million, and that has steadily declined. This is the actuals side of the budget, of the issue. When you look at this next slide, this will provide for you the overall funding in each year for the actual activity that will take place. And the interesting piece is that in the outer years, we are much more than lean. You couldn't possibly, for an agency this size, assume that $115, $120, or even $130 million is sufficient to retain a state, to achieve and maintain a state of good repair. This particular issue is of great importance. We will be, with the flexibility that we have, allocating dollars as required, and there should be a substantial improvement in this position if, in fact, the Investment Act is approved. We've identified through that process $7.2 billion worth of projects that we would like to advance. $2 billion of that is in the state of good repair, projects for state of good repair.
In terms of, to give you kind of over a 10-year period of time prior to us coming into these goals, when you took the MARTA capital plan in terms of what was budgeted, it was roughly, the capital program was on average for the last 10-year period of time, $325 million. So I'm trying to just give, and this did not, and this excluded the North Line extension. So it wasn't the big hunk of money. So just to give you an order of magnitude, we are now, the current fiscal year, we're down to a budget in the capital side of $188 million. I'm not talking about 132 in debt service. I'm just talking about pure capital program. And we have numbers that have been ranging, as you can see, in the 160 to 180. That is far below. So when you hear staff say that our focus has almost exclusively been on safety, regulatory, and minimum state of good repair. So for a system, and at $325 million, that was not a program where you were robustly going out there doing rail station modernizations and all of that. So to give you just a general sense, and in fact, and this is not just, once again, a MARTA issue. When you look at there have been studies that have been done fairly recently by the Department of Transportation about the backlog for transit systems, period. There was a report that came out on the top 7 transit systems in the country in April of 2009. The backlog on state of good repair for those big 7 systems, remember we're the 9th largest, was $50 billion. The Secretary of Transportation had that report updated for all systems and came up with roughly a number that was about $80 billion. So when we, as a part of us contributing to that report, what we identified at MARTA was that over a 20-year period, we were estimating that even in the good days, we were running short roughly about $6 billion for where we could actually see to really do what you want to do in terms of what you call a real state of good repair program. So this is just to give you the order of magnitude. When we say, sometimes when you get to budgeting something, it's almost like people get amnesia and they forget what it was. And so my point is, let's don't, I tell myself, let's don't get confused, because we can responsibly say that we can wind up making, hopefully we think we're not irresponsibly not putting stuff in safety and regulatory and leaving some dollars for state of good repair, but we've got $6.5 billion of MARTA infrastructure over the last 35 years that's out there. We are now a mature, middle-aged system with thousands of big things that move, and a capital program that we're budgeting now at below $200 million is not sufficient to be able to wind up handling that kind of a program. This is an agency that definitely needs to be roughly around, I would tell you, at least about $350 to $400 million. If you really wanted to be able to go and say we got 30-year-old system now, this is the rail model, this is a station modernization program. I want to be able to go through and do things in a very proactive manner.
Representative Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And on that point, Dr. Scott, I did review the list of projects, the state of good repair projects that you have submitted for the House Bill 277 plan. And my question is, what is Plan B? Should those projects, state of good repair projects, not be selected as part of the final list and or the referendum not pass? I was very alarmed to see the delay in some of the just general maintenance projects and the magnitude of what needs to be addressed. So what is Plan B should this windfall not occur?
What we're doing at this point, and that's why we've tried to take it through to where we can see what we could do over a 5-year period of time, but I will tell you that we would really, as an entire Fulton DeKalb and MARTA and its members, there will come a point over the next 3 to 5 years we'll have to significantly downsize the system. There's just no other way to say it, okay? And I'm not trying to be a prophet of doom and gloom, but the reality is that you can't make the bricks without hay, and there is not enough cost that you can just take out of the system and continue to run it at the same level and then not have the funding to wind up putting into it. It'll be a complete lack of reliability. We think we've got escalators and elevators that are down. Now you just can't maintain all the stuff. We got thousands of vital relays and all of that. So we will continue to focus on safety, but it'll basically be breakdown maintenance. I mean, that's unfortunate, but that's what it is.
Senator Ford.
When you say that, in response to Representative Riley's question, when you say downsize or if the windfall doesn't come in, what are you talking about, Dr. Scott? Realistically, what would the customers?
Realistically, and I mean, this will get into major discussions with the U.S. Department of Transportation. And I'm just being very honest, because of the kinds of when you wind up doing the downsizing, remember, we've accepted federal dollars, and many of the assets that we have obligations to, in fact, wind up continuing to operate them with useful life for a 50-year period of time. So you can't just go out there and close things without having an obligation to repay the federal interest. Because the investment, I'm getting to your point, and because the investments in rail infrastructure are so heavy, literally the first thing that would wind up happening, but I tell you, and the easiest would wind up being to almost disassemble the bus system. Now, whether or not the feds would wind up permitting us to do that under Title VI and service equity issues, I doubt it very seriously. So we are going to have a heck of a conundrum, because quite candidly, the reality is that what you've got real big fixed infrastructure, because you just can't close easily a rail system down. So the one that you would go to look at, which is providing tremendous service on the ground to particularly transit dependent, would wind up being on the bus side of the house, because you'd have to literally start closing facilities, I mean, to be able to double down, to actually bring down maybe $100 some million worth of cost in the system. You just can't do it in this kind of broad brush. You really got to start pulling it in and shrinking your footprint.
Okay. Follow-up question is this: in terms of referendum money, and I need to be educated on this. You know, the windfall, the supposed windfall. What can you use that referendum money for, and what can you not use the referendum money for under the strictures of the referendum law that we passed?
As the TIA exists today, what MARTA has the ability to do is to use the referendum money for anything that is capital, whether it is existing system or new. So that is another reason why you see in the MARTA list that we put our top priority, almost $2 billion, and the first group of projects you see are state of good repair. That is very allowable under 277. So that's where, and then we went to say, look, the next thing we want to do is to wind up being able to do some enhancement programs. But we're being very clear with everybody. State of good repair and preservation of the existing system is important. Now, if in fact, and we believe that having, we believe that having the upstairs, downstairs in terms of having had that restriction on MARTA is unfair. I'm just being very, however, I will tell you that if in fact we wound up being able to get state of good repair for existing core, plus the removal of the MARTA Act restrictions, because remember, I've only got a temporary relief on that right now in terms of the 50/50. So if MARTA were able to utilize its current penny more flexibly, and in fact in the roundtable, what comes out of it is a significant recognition by this region that maintaining the core infrastructure is a regional need, not just a Fulton and DeKalb County need, such that there is significant money put in there. Those kinds of things working together would help us to be able to piece together, if you will, something that can at least keep us all moving forward.
How is it that you'd be able to do that, Madam General Manager, when the law says that you cannot use it for anything that existed at MARTA before?
I can't, but the restriction is on operating. Right. The restriction is not on capital. So I cannot pay for any service, but I can repair. I can do a rail station modernization. I can do elevators. I can do escalators. I can upgrade train control. All of that is allowable under 277. What I cannot do is wind up taking a service that's on the street right now and expanding that service and putting and enhancing that service. I can't offset any of MARTA operations with it, but I can in fact use the dollars for capital.
So your operating deficit would not be affected by the referendum?
The operating deficit straight make would not be affected, except to the extent that we could be creative and wind up in fact with removal of the 50/50 restrictions and more putting of dollars into capital, wind up being able to offset capital dollars with the removal of the restrictions that would then release more of the original MARTA penny to be used for operations. So that essentially what could wind up happening, and I'm not saying that this is preferable, because it's still not, in my personal opinion, it is still not fair. However, if you could then wind up having the MARTA penny largely become an operating penny. And right now, that penny cannot wind up largely being an operating penny, because once 3 years are lifted, I have to go back to walling off and only using 50% of that penny for capital and 50% for operating. So that would certainly give us a degree of flexibility we don't have now.
All right. I've got a lot of lights, and we've got about a half hour left on the meeting and a lot of presentation left. So I'm going to recognize the two lights I've got lit up, which I believe are Representative Mitchell and Representative Riley. I would just ask you to keep it brief.
Yeah,
Representative Mitchell.
My question is going to be brief, and then if I may follow up with the observation, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Scott, it has been my experience that you and your staff have always been outstanding planners. Is your answer the same when it comes to, there's a $1.4 billion plus deficit in projected tax revenue between the fiscal years of 10 and 20, and as was alluded to by Representative Riley and Senator Fort, in my estimation, the tax referendum is in peril. We've got members of this very committee that I have firsthand knowledge are going to work against it. So my point is it just your same answer about what are the long-term projections if those things pan out the way I anticipate that they will?
Let me just say this. What I would say is that with all haste, whatever we all need to do to make this get to be right so that we can pass this referendum is critical. So I know there are a lot of different people got different opinions about, because the piece that's not going to change without having significantly increased regional and state and some good state participation in transportation and transit for this region is that the numbers don't work. And so killing it isn't going to accomplish anything at the end of the day in terms of what needs to happen for people and communities on the ground. And on top of this, we're only talking about the pieces we see. Right now, we got a federal government that's a tale of three cities in terms of what's going to happen with transportation, which is a major portion of this, and quite candidly, it's not looking good at all. We got a tale of three cities. We got a highway trust fund, which funds all the transportation nationally, that's broke. We've got a president that's got a robust budget but can't pass it. We've got a transportation infrastructure committee that has been real clear. They are going to advance a transportation authorization that is at FY 2008 funding levels at best. Overall transportation. That means roughly about a 25% cut in terms of regular formula dollars. And we have a Senate that hasn't said yet what it's going to do. And we have an authorization at the federal level that was over with as of September 30th of 2009. And we're all living on borrowed time. So in the numbers that we're talking about here in terms of the 1.4 and the 1.5 billions, all of that is not factoring in anything in terms of what is this to open federal picture that is also a major portion of how we have all been holding this together. If in fact that takes place, and we in fact wound up being at FY 2008 funding levels, that would wind up on the federal side of the house. And make no mistake, last year MARTA brought in totally in terms of federal dollars. And there was some aura, and we're very opportunistic. We go out of everything, was $110 million. So if I have to look at 25%, not because it's anything personal against MARTA, it's just that's what happens. We got to look at a 25% cut on that. I can assure you none of that's reflected in the numbers in front of you here.
Last question.
Yeah, it was my observation. You know, the fact of the matter is, as I look at systems all around the country since being involved with MARTOC, I talk frequently with the expert here, Senator Fort. You know, there are some systems that don't pay anything, as was pointed out to me by Senator Fort. We investigated for ridership because there's such an advantage to the community so far as commerce, so far as what it does to the environment and roads. I said that to say that perhaps, you know, the system, it may not be able to be profitable. And that may not be the goal of what we do. What I would suggest is the company I work for, some departments that are under me, there are some departments that are always in the red. However, we justify what the benefits would be if it were not for that department. I think what MARTA can do, and Chairman Durrett, as you go to the Commerce Club, giving your speech today, to let folk know, particularly the leadership here in this state and those who vote on the budget, what would be the effect if there were no MARTA? What would be the effect on commerce if people could easily and conveniently and safely get to the business and commerce centers? I presume that was the thought behind the Brave shuttle. The fact of the matter is, I'm certain that brings in not enough revenue to sustain the system, but what it does for commerce in this community is something that we should be going after, and that's my 2 cents worth.
Representative Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just quickly, I wanted to point out that currently the capital budget for MARTA, 40% or over 40% of that is debt service. So I don't want anybody to be thinking that if the existing penny was freed up to all be used for operations, quite a significant piece of that is already required to go toward debt service.
Absolutely.
So that certainly isn't going to be a financial solution in any way, shape, or form. And I just wanted to caution that no one looked at that as a potential solution.
No.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
No, it's all pieces. It's all pieces. You're exactly. We do about 100. I used to tell GDOT when they would come and do their presentations and we would tag team that I feel like frickin' frack, because when you look at it, we've got, like I said, we're running about $132 million in terms of debt, and we've got about a 1.5, almost $1.6 billion in terms of a long-term debt out there, and that's the set of obligations that we have. And when you look at what we'd be paying in interest, it's close to simply about that same number. So there's a lot of debt that is responsible for, in fact, helping to keep the system moving.
All right, let's continue with the presentation.
That's all I had, and I would just like to say thank you very much. And I do know that we glossed over many details. If there's any specific questions, items, or follow-up that you would like, in addition to what's already been requested, please let us know. And we'd be more than happy at any point to come back and go through those things. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Next is Davis Allen, who'll give you a brief overview on the pensions at MARTA.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the martoc committee. We're going to give you a brief overview on MARTA's pension. Currently, MARTA has 3 different pensions. We have one represented defined benefit pension for the represented employees. On the management side, we've got 2 plans. We've got a defined benefit and a defined contribution plan over on the management side. The reason that is there, we've closed off the management defined benefit plan. No one can join that plan now except for our police officers. This first slide shows the represented defined benefit plan. As of, this is the actuarial evaluation as of 1/1/2010. As you can see, the active participants in this plan is currently about 2,898. The inactive participant or retirees is around 1,655. The actuarial evaluation of this plan is valued at about $454,140,000. The unfunded actuarial accrued liability is only about $2.9 million. And I say only about $2.9 million. When you compare this plan to plans in Georgia or across the country, this plan is in excellent shape. It's funded at about 99.4%. And MARTA's cost to this plan each year is about $8.8 million. That reflects about 8.09% of payroll for the represented employees, and the employees currently are contributing about 2.45% of payroll, and we're looking to move that to 4.41%. Any questions on this slide? Okay. This next slide shows the normal retirement and the accrual rate. These 2% and 2.40s and so on, these are the multipliers that are used to calculate the benefits for an individual when they are ready to retire. And as you can see, it's based on your years of service. This will put in place the additional percentages on the multipliers were put there to encourage employees to stay around a little longer. Instead of leaving at 25 years, if you stay 26 to 27 years, your multiplier will go from 2.40 to 2.44. And that will give them a little incentive to stay on and work a little longer. Any questions on this page? This next page shows the historical funded ratio for the defined benefit plan for the represented employees. As you can see, early on in 2006, this plan was funded at 110%, which is excellent. We were overfunded for a long period of time. It only dropped below the fully funded level when the downturn of the economy happened back in 2008, and plans across the country suffered. This plan suffered, but we're bringing it back now, so it's in great shape.
Where do you anticipate it going with regard to the ratio? I mean, for on a going forward basis.
Right now, we're at 99.4%.
Which is pretty good.
Right. We want to exceed that. And where we're going, if we were to shut down
I'm sorry, not very good. It's very good.
Yes.
Right. But, I mean, you would anticipate, I mean, I see that there was the drop in 2009 to 97.4%. You would anticipate then that this upward trend would continue as the economy improves?
Yeah.
All right.
Right now,
and we'd be back over 100 probably.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Our actuarial assumption is 7.5% return, and based upon that and the required contribution from MARTA and the employee, we're estimating this to get around 104% somewhere along there. But it's going to take 2 to 3 years to get there. Now, this next slide, as I stated, for the non-represented employees, we have 2 plans. We have a defined contribution plan and a defined benefit. This is a defined contribution plan. As you can see, this plan has 388 participants, and inactive participant, we've got 263 participants there. This plan was put in place when we shut down the defined benefit plan. All new hires that are non-represented employees must join this plan. Their required contribution to this plan is roughly 6%, and MARTA will fund 3% to that plan of their pay. This next slide is the non-represented defined benefit plan. As I stated, this plan has been shut down except for MARTA Police. This plan has an active participants of about 981. There's about 1,171 retirees in this plan. The plan actuarial value of assets is around $250 million. At the downturn of the economy, that did drop to about 185. It's on its way back up, but we've had a high there of around 200, and I believe it got up as high as 274 million, and we're not back there yet. Also, this plan is underfunded. It has an underfunded value of $135 million. Based upon the actuarial assumption, if MARTA continues to contribute this $18.7 million and the plan is closed off, the actuarial assumption this plan will be back fully funded in 14 years. I know that's a long time, but that is the current actuarial assumption.
I've got a question from Representative Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are there 2 different financial advisors managing these plans?
Yes, ma'am.
Why is there such a disparity in the funded ratio?
Well, this plan was never fully funded. When you get to the next page, you'll see the history on it.
I do, and that's concerning.
Right. It has never been as fully funded as the represented plan. Callan and Associate is the financial advisor for this plan. Great and Confident is the financial advisor on the represented plan. Plus, this management plan took a big hit. Probably 4 or 5 years ago, we offered an early retirement, and we probably had 50 or 60 people to leave at the same time.
So the board of directors of MARTA made overt decisions on their funding levels of these plans, separate and independent, based on each plan?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Could you also briefly speak to the OPEB liabilities of MARTA, other post-employment benefits, and give us an indication of the funding level of those?
Great. Yes, the OPEB liability, when that came out a couple of years ago, MARTA decided to go ahead and start funding that. A lot of organizations still aren't funding it. But we had our actuary to do a study for us, and we've got a long-term plan, and we are funding it. And last year, the amount that we funded was $4.5 million. This year, the actuarial study says that I got to move that to $5.5 to $6 million in fiscal year 12. But we are current, and we are funding that liability.
Thank you.
All right, continue.
Okay. Now, this next slide shows what the multiplier is on the defined benefit plan for the non-represented employees. And we only have three multipliers, a 2%, 2.05, and a 2.1, and that's based on the years of service. And also, as I stated earlier, you can see the funded ratio over the years on that plan. Are there any other questions?
23
I'm done.
Okay. None, sir.
All right, thank you.
And our next presentation will be on the escalators and elevators, and that'll be Dwight Farrell.
Thank you.
Chair, I must say, since you've taken over, the committee has run much smoother.
Yes, Mr. Farrell.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the Martoc Committee. It's always a pleasure to be here. And in fact, I have been here, Dr. Scott said this is my second tour of duty. This time I've been here for 2 years, 364 days. Tomorrow will be my 3rd year anniversary at MARTA, and it has been a blast. We'll very quickly go through, for elevators and escalators, a program overview, elevator and escalator assets, escalator safety devices, the enhancements in vertical transportation that we've made since December of 2007, our customer communications process, and then, of course, how our safety record looks as it relates to elevators and escalators. Safety is first for us. As far as escalators are concerned, they will stop, but our objective is when they stop that they do so safely. We have had continuous improvement, we think, in improved reliability over the last 3 years. It is important to note that our elevators and escalators are original. Some of them put in place in 1971, so we'll go through that in a little greater detail. There are a number of checks and balances on vertical transportation in the state of Georgia. The Georgia Department of Labor is responsible for certifying our elevator and escalators. They do so annually. We have a repair and maintenance contract. We have a modernization project where we are rehabbing 30 elevators. We have board has just awarded a consulting contract for elevator and escalator consulting services and QA services. Then we have significantly added to our elevator and escalator management team, as Dr. Scott mentioned earlier this morning. And then we have made added to our own safety and QA process. Certainly there is better accountability as it relates to elevators and escalators going forward, and much more communication between the customer and the stakeholders as it relates to elevators and escalators. And there is in the 10-year capital improvement plan, there is money to modernize elevators and escalators in their program currently. As I mentioned to the committee when we were here the last time and mentioned earlier, escalators particularly will stop. They are designed to do so, and in fact we'll go through in detail the number of systems on the escalators that are designed to do that should something happen. And as long as they do so safely so that no one is injured, that's ultimately what we are looking for. And we certainly will talk to you later, as you'll see in the presentation, that while we have had that happen, the number of injuries as it relates to the number of people who go through our system is very, very small. But communication to our customers is extremely important. We have a lot of signage that we have on our escalators about, holding the handrail, not using strollers, et cetera, et cetera. We also have changed, and we'll talk about that a little later, procedures for large events to make sure that our system is secure. We have a comprehensive maintenance program that the board just awarded in September of 2010. It's a 3-year contract with 2 1-year options, and as you can see, the contract value is $26 million. And then again, we'll talk about there is currently a 30 escalators in a rehabilitation program as we speak. 16 of those have been completed, with the 14 that remain should be done by the end of fiscal year 2012, and that contract is valued at $17.8 million. Here is an inventory of escalators. We have 149 escalators at MARTA in 36 of the 38 stations. Indian Creek and Medical Center do not have escalators. And as you can see down at the bottom, we have 71 escalators that were manufactured between 1971 and 1980, another 67 that were manufactured between 1981 and 1990, and then 9 from 91 to 2000, and then 2 from 2000 to 2004. So as you can see, this is aged infrastructure. I'd also like to point out that as transit systems go, MARTA has the 5th largest number of escalators in the country as it relates to transit systems. So we have a significant inventory. Escalators, there are 112 of those, and as you can see, the dates line up in terms of their age, as well as what we had with the elevators, because they were all put in when we were building the stations along the same time. And you can also see that there are at least seven different manufacturers of elevators in the system. Now, I spoke earlier about safety devices on escalators. The pre-modernization escalators have 10 safety systems on them, from emergency stop button to a reverse motor to speed governors, broken step chain, skirt switch, gate switch, those kinds of things that are there. The new escalators, the ones that we have already done, will have this 10 plus the 11 through 20 that will also be part of the system. And so you can look at, for example, comb impact. If somebody jumps on the comb plate, the escalator is designed to stop. If the step were to break, it's supposed to stop the escalator because the step is missing. So one of the things that you will find, and we're already starting to see this, is that we have more instances where escalators stop because there are more safety devices on these new ones than what we had before. Now, for us as an organization, December 31st, 2007 is kind of the starting point for us, because as you're all aware, we had a couple of events that happened at 5 Points and the Dome Station on New Year's Eve. And we have taken these steps since then. So for escalators, it is December 31st, 2007. For escalators, it's January 2010. Those are the benchmark dates for us. And as you can see, we have modernized 16 of the 30 escalators. Again, that contract's expected to be done in July of 2012. And then the overall, one of the questions that was asked by Representative Jacobs is, when will we be done with rehabilitating escalators? Currently in the CIP 2012, it's already programmed in, and it will take that long. It takes about 14 weeks to rehab a single escalator. And so we take into consideration how many we have at a station, how we can manage that as it relates to what the customers' requirements are, and so we've laid that out that will take us that long to do. Certainly, we could accelerate it with more dollars, but we also think that doing so will also create a customer impact, and we've already experienced that when we shut them all down in January of 2010. So that is the current plan. January 2010 for elevators, again, was that date that we talked about. And I want to point out the third bullet point. VTX inspected all elevators, and we are awaiting the comprehensive report. All of the things that they recommended as it related to the incident where the little boy, where the door went open and the little boy fell down the elevator shaft, all of those recommendations have been addressed, every one of those. We are using the final report as a basis for what will be developing a rehabilitation program for elevators. So we'll have dollars in the budget right now. We're actually expecting to start actual renovation of elevators. I believe it is in 2014. So that is what's in the CIP as we speak as it relates to that. Now, this is all of the things that we have done since December 31st, 2010, as it relates to elevators and escalators. We obviously had someone that we brought in to help us with what happened with that event, and we have taken steps since then in terms of hiring and created this office of elevator and escalator, basically vertical transportation group. Dr. Scott introduced Tim Eason this morning, who's the manager of that group. We have added staff that we did not have before. In fact, one of the requests in the fiscal year 2012 budget is for additional resources in this area. I'd also like to point out that the last bullet point, we have obviously the maintenance contractor. We have a new one that started in September of last year. And then the consulting services, which we did not have before, we have on board now. And we have gone through, and with all of our, because we have so many large events, from the Peach Drop and all of the New Year's Eve activities, as well as the activities on the 4th of July and every other big event that comes here, whether it's a Falcons game, Braves, or what have you. We have changed our procedures to make sure that we have somebody available and near every one of our elevators and escalators to make sure if something happens, we can respond very quickly. And I'd like to point out there was a lot of discussion that happened at the Christmas tree lighting at Lennox. And we have researched that event over and over and over again. And one of the things that you can see, probably within about 4 seconds of the escalator starting to shut down, the police shut access off to the escalator. The people who were on it were able to get off safely, and no one was injured. That is what we are trying to do. We cannot avoid things like that happening, but we want to make sure that procedurally and that our equipment does what it's supposed to do to make sure that no one is injured. So one of the other procedural enhancements, we've eliminated the use of escalators as stationary steps. If an escalator doesn't work, we block it off. Now, I know you may see it in the mall and you may see it in a lot of other places where you can walk down the steps. Well, one of the things that can happen when you do that is if there's too much weight and the brakes aren't properly adjusted, it can freewheel. We don't want that. So if it's not working, you're not going to get on it. We have gone through and required maintenance contractor to retrain all their employees on the escalator brake systems because they're all different in the MARTA system. We have actually a more robust requirement in our contract for escalator maintenance than even what the state requires that we do. And so, again, we've adjusted the contract to make sure that before we have any of these large events, that all of those elevators and escalators in those stations where we know there's going to be large concentrations of usage, that we go through them before the event. And then we've strengthened our safety hold procedure process. If there's any doubt that there may be something that's unsafe with an escalator, we lock it down, or an elevator, we lock it down and nobody uses it until our safety department can review it and our QA group can review it. And that's independent of, the safety department is independent of the elevator and escalator maintenance group. Now, this particular slide, unfortunately, was a little bit out of place. It actually should have been towards the end, but I'll just go through it very quickly. From a customer communications point of view, as it relates to elevators and escalators, we make station announcements, particularly when elevators are out of service. If we have an elevator that's out of service and we are requiring you to go to another station, we have paratransit that will bring you back, take you to the appropriate station. And we're posting escalator information on the website now. The My Commute piece, we're planning to work to include elevators in that. So our whole objective is to be able to communicate to our customers what they can expect as it relates to vertical transportation in our stations. Maintenance contract service enhancements, brake frequency increase from quarterly to monthly. We don't use rebuilds anymore, only new units. We have a deep cleaning piece that we are adding to address some corrosion issues. We've increased the inventory, increased the number of elevator and escalator journeyman mechanics, requirement for a dedicated safety supervisor, and then we have a termination for cause for convenience clause in our contract, which we did not have with the previous one. And our current availability for the requirement is 98%. Here are the consulting services and the new functions and responsibilities, including because as Dr. Scott mentioned, we outsource elevator and escalator maintenance as well as any kind of rehabilitation of elevators or escalators. And this group will be responsible for preparing the technical bid specifications for elevator and escalator rehab. We have 30 escalators under rehab now. That means we have 119 more to go. We are intending, there's about 15 or so of them that we're going to have to do separately because they are a different manufacturing type. The rest of them we're planning to put out in one multi-year program, and so that's what they'll be working on. And so this group will also be doing design testing. And one of the things that is important to us, this last bullet, the quality assurance audits and reports. Within our regular bus fleet and rail fleet, our QA group will periodically go behind the PM inspections and check to make sure that the technicians have done what they were supposed to do. This is a piece that we have added for elevators and escalators. So 10 of them will be selected throughout the year, 10 elevators and 10 escalators, where our independent group will go behind what the contractor did to make sure that the contractor did the preventive maintenance as required by the contract. This is a new feature for us that we did not have this, we did not do this before this year. Now, as I wanted to point out to you, this is a listing for January 2010 of the number of injuries that took place as it relates to escalators for that 12-month period. And the average rail trips, that means on a monthly basis, and if you add the bus number into this, in our stations there's more than 5 million people in the station in all of our stations in the course of a month. And the highest that we had was 11 incidents in the month of October. So as you can see, and what we have found is that a lot of them is because someone was not holding their handrail, somebody was trying to sit down on an escalator, riding it down, and those sorts of things. So we just wanted to be able to make the point that our system as it relates to elevators and escalators is safe. This is looking at 2008 versus 2009 versus 2010. You can see that we went from 281 in 2008 to 94 in 2009 to 81 in 2010. This is the same thing with the elevator injuries and overall incidents. And when we mean incidents as it relates to elevators, that could be an entrapment, that can be anything as it relates to that. So that concludes my presentation. Certainly I'll be happy to answer. Me and all of the rail group to answer any questions that you may have as it relates to elevators and escalators.
Right. Mr. Farrell, if you can go back to, I guess, the page 35 slide.
Yes.
I guess my question is how many, and I mean you may have covered this, I was out for a little bit, how many escalators are currently not operating in the stations? Do you?
Tim?
We have 4 that are currently being modernized, so we consider those to be out of service. And, at this point, which ones are out of service or down for maintenance, or might have had a recent callback? I don't have that data handled. But just permanently out of service while they're undergoing maintenance, we only have 4.
Okay. Are there others in addition? There are others in addition to that are out of service, though.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
So I guess my question is then where it says to date 16 of the 30, that's 30 that are subject to the current modernization
that's
contract. Would there be more than that might be out of service that would be subject to a subsequent contract? I guess that's my question.
Let me.
When do we get to a point where we're largely operational in terms of escalators? That's what I'd like to know.
Well, because we have basically 119 more to go that we would have to modernize after this, there's always going to be some amount of them that are going to be down for the next 8 or 9 years. I mean, there's no way around that. So there's going to be some number of that going forward. Now, what we would expect as the system is modernized, that we would have less failures for
maintenance reasons, that does not necessarily mean that there will not be shutdowns, because now we have 20 more safety features that can cause an escalator to stop.
Right. No, I understand all of that, and I'm only trying to get my arms around, how long it ultimately, and it may be a period of years. I understand that.
It is a period of years. I mean, one of the things that we're trying to do now that we have changed from where we were is trying to be able to do the elevator and the escalator rehabilitation process in a manner that was a little more structured than how we had it before. We literally they could be at Indian Creek working on one, they could be at North Springs working on another one, and then turn around and have to go back to the same station to do another one, 6 months later. And so part of what we're trying to do is, and we're going to get some public input on how we do this, to lay out the best method for doing it station by station. We cannot take them all down at one time in a station, but we certainly want a process that allows us to do that. And so it really is what the stakeholders and the public can tolerate in terms of how many we take down at a time.
Okay. I'd like to get part of what I was hoping to get out of the presentation that's not here is to get a fuller picture of where we stand with respect to the number of escalators that are presently not in service, when we're going to get to where we ultimately need to be, which is safe, operational escalators, and get a full picture of that around the system. I don't think that this is the appropriate forum in which to do that.
Okay.
And so I'm going to assign that task to the infrastructure subcommittee. Senator Gooch just left, but that will be his task. That's what you get for leaving the meeting, right? But that will be his task to help the committee get its arms around that. One other question I had is, I believe Chairman Chambers had requested an audit.
An audit. Yes, she did.
And that's been completed, correct?
No, that's been on hold. That was when we were here the last time. The document that I gave you was we wanted to go back with her to be clear on what it was that she wanted the audit to focus on, and we were never able to close that loop.
Okay, but MARTA is willing to move forward with that audit.
Absolutely,
okay.
Absolutely.
In that vein, I will work up some requests along those lines and get to you what I would like the scope of that audit to be. Okay. But it is my intent to move forward with that audit.
Not a problem.
Senator Fort.
I was just wondering, is that audit going to be done in-house?
No.
It's outside audit.
No, that would be it's yes. Sherry Beckert, okay, who is the former independent external auditor, and Sherry Beckert. We provided them what we felt would be a scope, but we didn't think it was appropriate since it was a request of the committee nor did they just proceed on, quote, the MARTA scope. So that's what it is. We'll provide the draft that they have, and they're just really waiting to get the concurrence on the part of the committee as to that scope of services.
Is there a budget?
Yes.
Yes, there is.
How much is it going to cost?
It depends on the final scope.
Right.
It'll depend on the final scope.
Chair will be interested in that as well, in determining how and if we move forward. Representative Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is this audit that you're discussing in an enhancement to the 2006 required management audit?
This is totally a separate
and apart.
This is a separate and apart that was requested as a specific review of escalators and others.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right. Any further questions on this topic? Mr. Farrell, yes.
I didn't have a question, but I just did want to make a comment. We certainly believe that our elevators and escalators are safe today. We took an unprecedented step in January of 2010 to shut them down because we were concerned about that. And we have been working since then to make sure that when people come into the MARTA station, that they can ride vertical transportation in our systems and do so without fear. Our procedures and processes are geared to be able to address that. And so that's the piece that I want to make sure that before I left that we were clear on.
Any further questions on this topic? Seeing none, we'll close that off. Any further questions with regard to the presentation in general? Senator Ford.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, the folk from MARTA made it clear what their finances are, and the general manager said we need the money from a referendum, even with the restrictions on it. The question I have, Mr. Chair, I introduced a piece of legislation, Senate Bill 232, which would kind of rectify what I believe and many of my constituents believe to be onerous and burdensome issues regarding MARTA, including that restriction of the use of the penny sales tax in our region. And the question I have for you, Mr. Chair, I know there's been some discussion about rectifying that. It has not been a robust discussion, but there's been some discussion. I know my bill didn't see the light of day. But, Mr. Chair, I mean, what are your impressions? I mean, MARTA's in a dire situation and needs the resources to use beyond maintenance and capital. I mean, what is your perspective? Is making changes that would to lift the burdens on MARTA as the referendum would allow, is that something that we can credibly expect, or is that off the table?
And when you say burdens on MARTA, do you refer to the 50-50 split or just the whole?
Well, the 50-50 split, and there are a couple other things. The other one that I have the concern for is limiting, that is, MARTA would not be able to use any money it would get from a referendum for operating as opposed to capital and maintenance. I mean, one of the things that I have been impressed by over the years is how the union has really partnered with MARTA in many respects. I mean, MARTA, the union, and others have been, I think, good partners and have stepped up to the plate and said, we'll sacrifice. The question I have is it, in your view, because you speak to leadership on both sides on this issue, do you think that there's any possibility, any real possibility that those kinds of restrictions could be lifted from MARTA? Because MARTA's going broke. I don't think even getting operating from, maintenance and capital from that penny is really going to put MARTA where it needs to be. Is that something that we can expect, or is that something you support, or,
Well, I think the answer to that question, first of all, is, and it's a multifaceted answer because it's a multifaceted issue. First, this is not a legislative committee; it's an oversight committee. So, we're not directly handling any legislation in that area, and that, and for any legislation of any sort. And this is without speaking to whether any legislation is going to move forward on any particular topic, but any legislation of any sort obviously would have to go through the normal legislative process, and in particular through the House and Senate Transportation Committees, headed by Chairman Roberts and Chairman Mullis. So I cannot speak for them on legislation. What I will say is that it is the chair. First of all, I think that I would be, because we are already well into the process that is set forth in House Bill 277. The roundtable is meeting. The local governments have submitted their project lists. MARTA has submitted its project list. Everybody submitted their project lists, and the planning director for GDOT, Todd Long, is working through those lists at this time. I would be surprised if we saw a change to House Bill 277 directly, but I think MARTA has made clear where it would like to see that process go. And I think that is something that needs to be addressed with the roundtable. I mean, that's where it lies right now. But you also have this additional piece of the puzzle that is still on the table for, I believe, the 2012 legislative session. And I do think we will move forward with a piece of legislation that deals with globally, and maybe a couple of pieces of legislation, because I'm not quite sure what where we're going to place the MARTA Act changes, but I am committed to reviewing the MARTA Act with an eye toward improving it and modernizing it and bringing it into the 21st century. I think we will have a piece of legislation that will deal with governance, both for the region and for MARTA, in the 2012 legislative session. And I think when you put that together with the roundtable piece, we could have something that ultimately will be workable for the future. But that right now, that the responsibility for that is in a lot of different places. The roundtable for one, the Transit Governance Study Commission for another. I know ARC's got their Transit Planning Board committee that has worked on the issue. That's another place where it's being worked on. And then finally, with respect to the MARTA Act, our governance subcommittee is going to perform the review there, and I do intend for that subcommittee to come forward with a concrete legislative proposal by the end of that process, which should be the end of this year.
I think I understand.
All right. Representative Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if now is the appropriate time on our agenda, the request for documents.
Oh, certainly. We'll get there in just 1 second. Let me get Representative Geisinger.
Dr. Scott, if you would, please. MARTA has annually published the salaries in the old days in the newspaper, which is too expensive to do today. And I think we had advised you several years ago to put them online. Are they online today?
I'm not sure. Yes, they are.
They are. And how often do you update them?
I would annually.
Okay. That's all I need?
Representative Geisinger, we've kept up with that request from the beginning, the original request. They are listed under our employee ID numbers, and not instead of the individual names.
That's fine.
Each year we've updated those.
Thank you.
All right. So the MARTOC report is available on MARTA's website. All right. We are now at the part of the agenda where I'm going to request some documents, and I'll also allow committee members to chime in. First and foremost, and most importantly, we have some new members on the committee, and also I'm not sure, who. I still have my copy of the of this year's MARTOC report, but I think it's a very important document for every member of the committee to have. So if you can provide a copy of the MARTOC report to every member of the committee except for me, because I have mine, that would be greatly appreciated, and please provide those directly to the committee members. The second item, and I will put all of these in writing as well. Second item, I am going to task the Budget and Fiscal Subcommittee with a review. Members of the media sometimes tend to pick out an item here or there and sensationalize it, but we also have a job to do on this committee. And so I would like for MARTA to provide a complete listing of purchasing card transactions for 2010. We'll start there for the calendar year 2010. We'll start there And if there is no cause for concern, then we may not ask for anything more. But that seems, the most recent calendar year gone by seems like a logical place to start. And then the review of that will be handed off to the Budget and Fiscal Subcommittee. We had talked about some form of digestible consultant report on the. I don't want every report that's out there. I'm sure there might be many. Am I incorrect about that? All right. Whatever the best exemplar is of a consultant's report on distance fares, and any additional information that you might be willing to provide the committee on where we go from here with that issue would be appreciated. I asked for a MARTA's comparison of fare box recovery, and again, I'm not making any commentary on the 29%. It might be exactly the right number. I would like to see, though. I would like to see where MARTA falls compared to its peers, and I will let you take the first cut at who the peers are. So if you can provide that information, that would be helpful. The audit, it was mentioned that there is a scope of work for a performance and operation. Is it performance audit?
This is really a performance. It's called a management audit, but we said expand it to make it a operational performance audit, much beyond the traditional management audit.
All right. At the same time that you provide that scope, you don't need to provide me with any drafts that currently exist, but at the same time as you provide that scope to the MARTA board, I would appreciate that scope of the performance audit being provided to whatever you're giving to the board. I would like for you to give to the oversight committee as well. I think that particular project that MARTA is about to engage in will be of significant interest to this committee. Finally, I am going to. Dr. Scott? Is there someone? If we had questions about consulting contracts, and ultimately this is going to be a task for the Budget and Fiscal Committee. If we, obviously there are tabs in the. There are tabs in the MARTOC report that relate to consultant contracts and as well to payments to consultants. Is there one person or a very small number of people who, if we had a meeting of the Budget and Fiscal Subcommittee, could answer questions based upon what's in the MARTOC report? We then may request additional documents, but right now I just would like the Budget and Fiscal Subcommittee to be able to interface with MARTA staff about the value that MARTA is getting out of consulting contracts.
Yes, we could wind up pulling a very small group together. I would tell you if we had roughly 5 to 6 people, they could cover the bulk of the contracts that are there. I'd have the contracts, the legal, over infrastructure, finance, and so it wouldn't be much more than about a group of 6. If it gets real in the weeds, I might have to call somebody, but for the most part, we could do that.
All right. And then finally, this is not a document request, but I believe that the MARTA board, and this was publicized, took a tour of the system, and that I believe has been offered to MARTOC as well. I would very much like to take you up on that. As soon as we can maybe do it after the legislative session, say sometime in May. So if you can propose some dates for that, I will coordinate with committee members, and we will get that scheduled. Now, any other requests from members of the committee? I've got Representative Riley. You had requested first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If these documents are available online, just let me know and I'll self-serve, but I would very much like to see the most recent audits of the pension plans of the entire MARTA system. If you have a report on your OPEB trust, and if you have your most recent capital plan. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Do the members of the committee prefer that we would wind up being able to do things by disc and online as opposed to a lot of paper? It's fine with us one way or the other, but if there's a preference, we'd be more than happy to do online, disc, and that kind, because some of these documents do get to be pretty voluminous.
I would prefer that as much be provided to us electronically as possible. So what I will do is provide to Rhonda and Scott a list of the. Do you have a list of all the? Okay. Well, then you've got that. A list of all the committee members. Mm-hmm. Provide that to us electronically. The only thing that I would like to be provided to everybody in paper format is the MARTOC report.
Gotcha.
Senator Fort. Do you have anything?
One, we've already asked regarding the audit for the escalators. I'm interested in how much that's going to cost. It seems to me that we need to be very careful about demanding from you that which you all could be using to help fund people getting from A to B. So I know we had talked about that before. Two, the Brave Shuttle. I have constituents who are concerned that the Brave Shuttle was restored when the senior citizens on the 42 Moreland Avenue they got to walk several extra blocks to get to the bus. So I'd like any documentation on how much the re-implementation of the Brave Shuttle is going to cost.
Be happy to, sir.
Three, and that and that is a constituent issue, and I know you'll follow up on that because and then three, the restrooms. You all have shut down the restrooms, I think, last fiscal year.
Yes, sir.
Once again, I have a lot of senior citizens who, that's a real burden. They have to wait until they get home to use a restroom. And I'd like to know what are the cost savings that you have achieved at closing those restrooms. How many are open? I believe the only one that's open now is at 5 Points.
Well, we actually modified. We have 9 restrooms that are open. We wound up doing all the major locations, but we did take, with the exception of those 9, we took them down. And I can tell you that one of the things we did as a cost reduction measure last year was we reduced the number of station agents from 131 to about 60. And so you can't have restrooms open without having people to be able to open them and all of that. So that was one of the cost pieces that we looked at. But I'll give you
if you could provide those numbers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. As I mentioned, with the request that I have made, and I will also second the request for. With respect to the requests I have made, and I will also second the request for the audits that Representative Riley has requested, particularly the pension plans and the overall, any recent audits of the overall of the system as a whole. I will put those in writing to you as well, so that I know we've thrown a lot your way, so that you have directly from me clearly stated on paper what we're looking for, and then if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to address them to the chair. All right. Thank you all very much, MARTA staff and everybody, for coming to this first 2011-2012 term MARTOC meeting. I want to also thank the committee members for being here on an off day for the legislature. Look forward to continuing to work through not just the core mission of MARTOC with MARTA MARTA, which is the budget and fiscal oversight role, but in addition, figuring out ways that together we can move transit forward and get us squarely into the 21st century with regard to both regional transit and with regard to how MARTA fits into a broader regional vision. So I thank you very much for being with us today, Dr. Scott, and everyone who has joined us. There being nothing more to come before this committee, this meeting is adjourned.